The Silent Guardian's ambassador Kelrin of Elphys had served on the Galactic Council for only 3 solar cycles, but the empty seat had haunted him from his first day. It sat in the inner circle, a position of honor reserved for founding members and species of exceptional contribution. The seat bore Earth's emblem, a blue and green world wrapped in white clouds, polished to perfection despite decades of emptiness. Every council session, Kelrin found his eyes drifting to that vacant chair, wondering about the absent species that maintained such a prominent position without ever attending. The other ambassadors never discussed it. When Kelrin tried to raise questions during informal gatherings, conversations would shift awkwardly to other topics. Senior diplomats would suddenly remember urgent appointments. Even his own mentor, Ambassador Turon, had warned him gently to let the matter rest. But Kelrin could not. His species valued truth and transparency above all else. An unexplained mystery at the heart of galactic governance offended his fundamental nature. He began his investigation quietly, accessing public records in the Council archives. Earth had been granted full membership status 180 years ago. A unanimous decision that the records showed was celebrated across the galaxy. The humans had performed remarkable acts of assistance during what historians called the Salvation Era, rescuing stranded colonies, providing medical aid during pandemics, and offering technological solutions to problems that had plagued other species for generations. They asked for nothing in return, working tirelessly and then departing before formal thanks could even be offered. The Council had insisted on granting them membership. Earth accepted with grace and sent their first ambassador, a woman named Ambassador Chun-Li. She attended exactly 1 full session. At its conclusion, she approached the Council leadership privately. The official record stated simply that Earth would maintain its membership but could not commit personnel to regular attendance due to pressing commitments elsewhere. The Council accepted this explanation without protest. An Earth seat had remained empty ever since. Kelrin found the annual reports Earth submitted as required by Council law. Each report was identical, filed precisely on schedule for 180 years. The message never varied, just for words that explained nothing while hinting at everything. Position maintained. Status unchanged. What? Position unchanged from what? The questions consumed Kelrin until he could barely focus on his regular duties. He began reaching out to older ambassadors, those who had served long enough to remember when humans first appeared in galactic affairs. Most refused to speak with him. A few offered cryptic warnings about leaving well enough alone. One elderly Corthon ambassador, his scales dulled by age, finally took pity on Kelron's persistence. They met in a private garden, away from recording devices and curious ears. The old Corthon spoke slowly, his voice heavy with something that might have been respect or might have been fear. He told Kelran about ships that vanished in the outer regions, about spaces on star charts marked as navigational hazards for reasons no one could quite explain, about rescue beacons that were answered by human vessels, appearing from nowhere before official responders could even begin mobilizing. He told Kelran about whispers of installations in the deep void, massive structures that appeared on no official registry. He spoke of human ships that moved through regions considered impassable, of distress signals from the frontier that would suddenly cease without explanation, and of the unspoken agreement among council members never to investigate too closely. When Kelran asked why, the old Corthon simply said that some truths were too heavy for the galaxy to bear, and that humanity had chosen to carry that weight alone. The conversation left Kelran more determined than ever. He filed an official request to visit Earth's home system. The request was denied on procedural grounds. He filed again with additional documentation. Another denial. On his 5th attempt, he received an unexpected response. Not from Earth, but from something called the Outer Defense Coordination. The message was brief and formal. If Ambassador Kelron wished to understand Earth's absence from council sessions, he was invited to visit Outpost Sentinel Prime in Zone 7 of the Outer Rim. Transportation would be provided. He should come alone and tell no one of his destination. The coordinates placed the outpost far beyond any established trade routes, in a region of space that most navigation systems marked as empty and unremarkable. Kelron informed his staff he would be away on personal research for several weeks. Only Theron knew the truth. and his mentor's expression when Kelran told him was a mixture of resignation and concern. Theron made Kelran promise to return, to share what he learned, no matter how disturbing it might be. The human transport ship that collected him was unlike any vessel Kelran had encountered. It was built for function over form, bristling with sensor arrays and what he recognized as weapon systems far more advanced than anything in standard galactic arsenals. The crew was small and professional, treating Kelran with courtesy but maintaining a certain distance. They were young, most of them, but carried themselves with the bearing of veterans who had seen more than their years should allow. The journey took 6 days, through increasingly empty regions of space. The crew remained busy throughout, constantly monitoring systems and running what appeared to be combat readiness drills. When Kelran asked about this, a young communications officer named Marcus simply said they maintained preparedness protocols at all times. It was not a suggestion of paranoia but a statement of operational necessity, delivered with the casual acceptance of someone describing routine procedure. Outpost Sentinel Prime appeared suddenly as they dropped from faster-than-light travel. Kelran had expected a military station, but nothing had prepared him for the reality. The installation was enormous, larger than any structure he had seen outside of major planetary shipyards. It was not a single station, but a complex network of platforms, defensive arrays, and docking facilities that stretched across millions of cubic kilometers of space. Hundreds of ships moved in precise patterns around the facility, and Kelran could see construction continuing on additional sections even as he watched. But it was what lay beyond the station that truly captured his attention. Space itself looked wrong there. It rippled and shifted like heat waves rising from sun-baked stone. Colors that should not exist flickered at the edges of his perception. Looking at it too long made his head ache and his stomach turn. He realized with growing horror that he was seeing a tear in reality itself, a wound in the fabric of space that should not and could not exist according to everything he understood about physics and cosmology. Commander, Elena Vasquez met him in the docking bay. She was perhaps 40 years old in human terms, with close-cropped dark hair and eyes that held the exhausted determination of someone who had long ago accepted an impossible burden. She wore a military uniform marked with insignia Kelran did not recognize, and when she shook his hand, he felt calluses that spoke of hard physical labor despite her command position. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She led him through corridors filled with personnel moving with purposeful efficiency, past medical bays treating injuries Kelran could not identify, through briefing rooms where tactical displays showed information that made no sense. They arrived finally at an observation deck overlooking the anomaly in space. Up close, the wrongness was even more pronounced. Kelran felt his skin crawl just looking at it. Asterisk. Commander Vasquez stood beside him, her stance that of someone who had spent countless hours staring at the same view. She began to speak, her voice steady and matter-of-fact, explaining what Kelran was seeing. She called it a breach point, one of dozens that existed scattered across what humans termed the frontier threshold. These were weak points in the barriers that separated their universe from others, from dimensions where the laws of physics operated differently and where beings evolved that were fundamentally incompatible with existence in normal space. Humans had discovered the first breach 183 years ago during deep space exploration. A science vessel had detected unusual readings and gone to investigate. The crew had encountered something emerging from the breach, an entity that Vasquez described as a Void Watcher. The science vessel was destroyed, but not before transmitting everything they had learned. Earth immediately understood the threat. If these entities found their way through the breaches into normal space, they would spread like an infection, corrupting reality itself wherever they touched. Humanity had tried to warn the Council. They submitted detailed reports with all available data. They explained the danger and requested a coordinated galactic response. Kelran felt shame wash over him as Vasquez described what happened next. The Council formed committees. They debated the validity of the data. They questioned whether humans had properly interpreted what they found. They argued about jurisdiction and responsibility and proper protocols. The debates stretched across years while more breaches were discovered and more entities attempted to push through. Eventually, Earth stopped sending reports. They stopped requesting help. They simply mobilized every resource they possessed and began building installations at every breach point they could find. They trained soldiers to fight enemies that should not exist. They developed weapons to combat things that violated natural law. They established a defensive network spanning thousands of light years, all focused on keeping the breaches contained and the Void Watchers on the other side of reality. For 180 years, humanity had maintained this vigil. Generations of humans were born, lived, and died on stations like Sentinel Prime, never seeing Earth, never experiencing the peaceful civilization they protected. They fought a war the rest of the galaxy did not even know existed, suffering casualties and losses that would have broken most species, and they did it all in silence because they had learned that asking for help was futile. As Vasquez finished her explanation, alarms began to sound throughout the station. Red lights flashed, and the calm efficiency of the corridors transformed into controlled urgency. Vasquez checked a display on her wrist, and her expression tightened. A breach event was beginning. Something was trying to come through. She looked at Kelvin and asked if he wanted to see what humanity had been fighting all these years. His voice failed him, but he managed to nod. They moved to the command center, a vast room filled with displays and personnel coordinating defensive responses. Through the main view screen, Kelvin watched as the breach widened. Space tore open like a wound, and something began to emerge. He could not properly see it. His eyes could not focus on its form. It seemed to exist in too many dimensions at once, its shape constantly shifting and reconfiguring in ways that made no geometric sense. Just looking at it caused physical pain. Human ships swarmed toward it immediately. Energy weapons fired, creating patterns of light against the darkness. The entity responded with attacks that bent space itself, and Kelvin watched in horror as two ships were simply erased from existence, crushed out of reality by forces he could not comprehend. But the humans did not retreat. More ships arrived, more weapons fired, and gradually, impossibly, they began to drive the entity back toward the breach. The battle lasted 40 minutes. When it finally ended, the breach had stabilized, and the entity had been forced back into whatever nightmare dimension it came from. But the cost was evident in the casualty reports flowing across the displays. 73 humans dead, over 200 wounded, 4 ships destroyed completely. And this, Vasquez told him quietly, was considered a minor engagement. The real battles could last for days and cost thousands of lives. Kelvin stood in the command center as the activity gradually returned to normal operations. He watched the crew resume their duties with the practiced ease of people who had done this countless times before. He saw medical teams moving efficiently to treat the wounded. He heard damage control reports and observed repair crews deploying to fix what could be fixed. And he understood finally why Earth's seat remained empty. These people could not spare anyone to sit in council chambers and debate trade agreements. Every human who could fight was needed here, holding a line the rest of the galaxy did not even know existed. Commander Vasquez placed a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was gentle despite the strength in her grip. She told him he was welcome to stay as long as he needed to understand fully. She could arrange visits to other outposts if he wished to see the full scope of humanity's defensive network. But she also warned him that what he chose to do with this knowledge would have consequences. The truth could not be unlearned, and carrying it would change him forever. Kelvin looked out at the breach, at the wrongness in space that humanity stood guard over. He thought about the comfortable council chambers, where he spent his days discussing matters that suddenly seemed trivial. He thought about the thousands of humans spread across dozens of outposts, fighting and dying to protect species that did not even know they needed protection. And he knew that he could never return to his old life unchanged. The empty seat was not a mystery to be solved. It was a testament to sacrifice beyond anything the galaxy had acknowledged, and Kelvin would make certain that sacrifice was finally recognized. Asterisk. The price of peace. Kelvin remained at Outpost Sentinel Prime for 18 days, though time seemed to lose meaning in that place where humans lived between heartbeats and battles. Commander Vasquez assigned him quarters near the observation deck and gave him full access to non-classified areas of the station. What he witnessed during those days would remain burned into his memory for the rest of his life. He watched the daily routines of soldiers who treated the impossible as ordinary. Morning briefings detailed breach activity across all monitored zones with the same casual professionalism other species might use to discuss weather patterns. Training exercises prepared crews for scenarios that violated every law of physics Kelvin had studied. Medical staff treated injuries caused by weapons that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Wounds that conventional medicine could not properly address because they damaged reality itself, along with flesh.kel. Rand met a young pilot named Sarah Chun, barely 25 years old, who flew reconnaissance missions along the breach perimeters. She had been born on Outpost Horizon, another facility in the defensive network, and had never set foot on Earth. Her parents served here, as had her grandparents. When Kelvin asked if she resented a life spent fighting a war most of the galaxy did not know existed, Sarah looked genuinely puzzled by the question. This was simply what her family did, what humanity did. Someone had to stand watch, and humans had proven capable of bearing that burden. The concept of resentment seemed foreign to her, replaced by a quiet pride in purpose that Kelron found both humbling and heartbreaking. He spent time in the medical facilities, where doctors performed miracles daily with resources stretched impossibly thin. A surgeon named Dr. Amario Conquo explained that supplies were always limited because everything had to be transported from Earth or manufacturing stations deep in human-controlled space. The Council worlds were closer, their medical facilities more advanced in some ways, but requesting aid would mean explaining why it was needed. Humanity had decided long ago that secrecy served the galaxy better than truth. If other species knew about the breaches, panic might spread. Worse, well-meaning attempts to help might compromise carefully established defensive protocols. Dr. Okonkwo showed Kelrin patients recovering from exposure to what she called reality corruption. The security officer named James Park had been too close when a Void Watcher partially manifested during a breach event. The entity's presence had affected him at a fundamental level, causing cellular degradation that modern medicine struggled to reverse. James would survive, but he would never fully recover. He would carry the scars of fighting something that should not exist for the remainder of his shortened life. When Keldron visited him, James smiled weakly and joked that at least he had a good story to tell, even if he could never tell it to anyone outside the defense network. Asterisk. On his 8th day at Sentinel Prime, Kelran requested to visit other outposts. Vasquez arranged transportation without hesitation. Over the following week, he traveled to 5 additional facilities, each guarding a different breach point, each telling the same story of human dedication and sacrifice. At Outpost Meridian in Zone 12, he met Commander Joe Wei, a man in his 60s who had commanded the installation for 30 years. Joe showed him memorial walls bearing the names of fallen personnel, thousands upon thousands of them, each representing a life spent protecting strangers who would never know their names. At Firebase Vigilant, a smaller facility in Zone 19, Keldron witnessed a major breach event. The alarms began just after the station's equivalent of dawn. Within minutes, every available ship launched, and defensive platforms activated with practiced precision. The entity that emerged was massive, easily 10 times the size of the creature Kelron had seen at Sentinel Prime. It had appendages that seemed to reach through multiple dimensions, weapons that fired beams of unreality that dissolved anything they touched. The battle lasted 6 hours. Keldon watched from the command center as human forces threw everything they had at the creature. Ships darted in coordinated attack patterns, weapons fired in precisely timed sequences, and slowly, incrementally, they wounded the entity enough to drive it back. But the cost was staggering. 19 ships destroyed, 407 personnel killed, nearly 1,000 wounded. Many critically. The breach had been held, the entity forced back, but the price paid in human lives made Kelrin physically ill. After the battle, he walked through the station's corridors and saw exhausted personnel returning to duty stations, saw medical teams working desperately to save the wounded, saw engineers already beginning repairs on damaged systems. There was grief, certainly. He saw people crying quietly in corners, saw the weight of loss in every face, but there was no discussion of surrender, no suggestion that perhaps this burden was too heavy to bear. They mourned their dead, treated their wounded, repaired their equipment, and prepared for the next battle because that was what needed to be done. Kelron found himself in the station's small memorial chapel, a quiet space where personnel could remember fallen comrades. The walls held photographs and personal items from those who had died defending the breach. He stood there alone, surrounded by the faces of the dead, and finally allowed himself to weep. These humans had sacrificed everything, and the galaxy they protected had not even bothered to ask why they never came to council sessions. A chaplain found him there, an older woman named Reverend Martha Thompson, who had served at Firebase Vigilant for 15 years. She sat beside him without speaking, offering silent companionship. When Kelrin finally found his voice, he asked her how humanity endured this. How did they maintain hope and purpose when the war never ended and recognition never came? Martha smiled sadly and explained that humans did not fight for recognition. They fought because someone had to, and they were capable of doing so. She spoke of an old Earth concept called duty, a commitment to protect others regardless of personal costs. Humanity had looked at the breaches and the Void Watchers and understood that if they failed, entire civilizations would fall. The question of whether to fight had never truly existed. The only question was how to fight effectively, and humans had spent nearly 2 centuries answering that, questioned with blood and determination. She told Kelrin about the rotation system, how personnel served 3-year tours at breach installations before returning to Earth or other human colonies for rest and recovery. She explained that despite the danger, there was never a shortage of volunteers. Young humans grew up hearing stories of the frontier threshold, understanding from childhood that their species bore a unique responsibility. Many chose to serve, carrying forward the legacy of parents and grandparents who had stood the same watch. Kelrin asked why humanity never demanded that other species share this burden. Martha's answer was simple and devastating, because training other species to fight Void Watchers would take decades, and humanity could not afford to weaken their defensive lines during that training period. Because explaining the true nature of the threat might cause panic that would destabilize galactic civilization. Because humans had tried asking for help once, and learned that bureaucracy moved slower than existential threats. It was easier and safer to simply continue doing what they had always done, protecting the galaxy in silence. On his 15th day away from Sentinel Prime, Kelrin visited Outpost Last Light, the most remote facility in the defensive network. It guarded a breach in a region of space so isolated that supplies arrived only once every 3 months. The personnel there served 6-month tours instead of 3 years because the psychological strain of isolation was so severe. Commander Raj Patel, who led the installation, explained that Last Light had the lowest rate of breach activity but the highest rate of mental health challenges. Fighting enemies was one thing. Doing so in complete isolation, knowing that reinforcements were weeks away if anything went wrong, was another entirely. Yet even there, Kelrin found the same dedication and quiet resolve. A young technician named Leo Young showed him the breach monitoring systems, explaining with obvious pride how the equipment worked and how they had improved detection capabilities over the years. Liu had been at Last Light for 4 months and would serve 2 more before rotation. He missed his family on Earth desperately but understood the importance of his work. Someone had to maintain the sensors. Someone had to watch the breach. He was honored to be someone. Kelrin returned to Sentinel Prime emotionally exhausted and fundamentally changed. Commander Vasquez met him in her office, offering tea made from Earth-grown leaves. They sat in silence for a while before she asked what he intended to do with what he had learned. Kelrin had been considering that question throughout his journey. The answer was both simple and terrifying. He would return to the Galactic Council and tell them everything. Vasquez nodded slowly, unsurprised. She warned him that the Council might not react as he hoped. Institutions protected themselves. And acknowledging humanity's sacrifice meant acknowledging the Council's failure to act 180 years ago. There would be political resistance, attempts to discredit or dismiss his testimony. Some would argue that humans chose this path, and therefore bore no right to complaint. Others would suggest that the threat was exaggerated, that surely the breaches could not be as dangerous as described. Kelrin understood the challenges ahead, but he also understood that silence was no longer acceptable. These humans deserved recognition. The galaxy deserved to know the truth about who protected them and at what cost. He would face whatever political consequences arose from speaking out because compared to what humanity endured daily, political discomfort seemed insignificant. Vasquez provided him with detailed reports and carefully edited video footage that could be shared without compromising operational security. She wrote a formal statement explaining humanity's position and their willingness to cooperate with any genuine galactic defense initiative, though she made clear that Earth could not and would not abandon the breach installations regardless of what support might eventually materialize. The breaches existed. The Void Watchers were real. Humanity would hold the line until holding it became impossible, and they prayed that day never came. The journey back to Council space took another 6 days. Kelron spent the time organizing his presentation and preparing himself for the battle ahead. He knew he was returning as a different person than the one who had left. He had seen truth that most of the galaxy remained ignorant of, and that knowledge came with a responsibility. He could not unsee what he had witnessed. He could not unknow what he had learned. All he could do was ensure that the sacrifice he had witnessed was finally acknowledged. Upon arriving at the Council homeworld, Keldron immediately filed for an emergency session. His request was initially denied, but he persisted, citing his right as an ambassador to present critical intelligence regarding galactic security. After 3 days of bureaucratic resistance, the Council leadership reluctantly agreed to hear him. They scheduled the session for the following week, giving Kelron time to prepare while also giving opponents time to organize resistance. The day of the session arrived with Kelron feeling both terrified and determined. The Grand Council chamber filled with representatives from hundreds of species, most looking annoyed at being called for an unscheduled meeting. Kelron stood at the central platform, his presentation materials ready, his resolve strengthened by memories of faces he had seen at the breach installations. He looked up at Earth's empty seat, that polished chair that had haunted him for so long, and finally understood its true meaning. He began speaking, his voice steady, despite his racing heart. He explained where he had been and what he had discovered. He showed footage of the breaches, of the Void Watchers, of human forces fighting impossible battles against impossible enemies. He presented casualty figures and operational reports. He told stories of individuals he had met, humans who sacrificed everything to protect a galaxy that did not even know they existed. The Council chamber fell silent as the truth unfolded before them. Kelron saw shock on some faces, denial on others, Sami on money. He spoke for nearly 2 hours, laying out 180 years of human sacrifice in meticulous detail. He explained how humanity had tried to warn them, how the Council had failed to act, how Earth had eventually stopped asking for help and simply shouldered the burden alone. When he finished, silence filled the chamber. Then the questions began, and with them, the resistance Vasquez had predicted. Some demanded additional proof. Others questioned the reliability of his account. A few suggested that humans had exaggerated the threat to gain sympathy or political advantage. Kelron answered each challenge with patience and evidence, but he could feel the resistance hardening among certain factions. The debate stretched across 3 days. Proposals were made and rejected. Committees were suggested and dismissed. Some species offered immediate military support. Others insisted on forming research groups to study the breaches before committing resources. The old patterns of bureaucracy and political maneuvering threatened to consume the moment, and Kelron felt despair growing that nothing would actually change. On the 3rd day, something unexpected happened. Ambassador Terran Kelron's mentor stood and requested to speak. The elderly Velthith was respected across the Council, his voice carrying weight earned through decades of service. He admitted that he had known about the breaches, that many senior ambassadors had known for years. They had chosen silence because acknowledging the truth meant acknowledging their own failure. He called for immediate action, for resources to be allocated to support human defensive efforts, and for formal recognition of humanity's service. His words shifted the debate's momentum. Other senior ambassadors began to speak, some admitting their own knowledge and shame, others expressing genuine shock and determination to help. Slowly, painfully, consensus began to form. The Council would officially recognize Earth's defense of the galactic frontier. Resources would be allocated to support human installations. Volunteer forces from other species would be trained to assist at breach points, though this would occur gradually and under human command authority given their expertise. The vote was not unanimous, but it passed with significant majority support. For the first time in 180 years, the Galactic Council formally acknowledged what humanity had been doing and committed to sharing the burden. Kelrin felt relief, mixed with exhaustion. It was a beginning, though only a beginning. 3 weeks later, a response arrived from Earth. It was addressed to the Council as a whole, signed by Fleet Admiral Catherine Rodriguez, Supreme Commander of Human Defense Forces. The message was brief and formal. Earth accepted the Council's recognition with gratitude. They welcomed assistance from other species, though integration would require time and careful planning. They appreciated the allocation of resources and would coordinate distribution to installations across the frontier threshold. But the message ended with words that made Keldron smile through tears. Earth's council seat would remain empty for the foreseeable future, not because humanity rejected the council's gesture, but because the breach installations still required every available person. Perhaps someday, when defensive lines were secure enough to allow it, a human ambassador would return to that polished chair. Until then, the empty seat would serve as a reminder of duty fulfilled in silence, of sacrifice made without expectation of recognition, and of the price some species paid so others could live in peace. Keldrun stood in the empty council chamber late that evening, looking up at Earth's seat. It no longer haunted him with mystery. Instead, it inspired him with its meaning. That vacant chair represented the finest qualities any species could possess: selflessness, determination, and the courage to bear impossible burdens alone rather than risk the safety of others. Humanity had held the line for 180 years. Now, finally, the galaxy would help them hold it, and perhaps together they could ensure that humanity's sacrifice had not been in vain. The empty seat remained, and Kelrin understood that it should. Some symbols were too powerful to abandon, some reminders too important to forget. Earth's chair would stay vacant until humanity decided the time was right to fill it, and the galaxy would honor that decision by never forgetting why it was empty in the first place. Asterisk.